Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, June 5th, 2022, and today we're going to be taking a look at a 2024 election matchup between Governor Ron DeSantis from the state of Florida and President Joe Biden. Now, this is an election that, of course, will take place in the 2024 year in November, and in just over 2 years, we will be in the full swing of the general election, which means we can start speculating and getting an understanding as to who might actually win this presidential election, a very high stakes one that will be a test for Democrats and Republicans across the nation and will be very interesting and very, very contested. Now, Ron DeSantis is someone that I actually did a video on months ago talking about a matchup between him and Biden. I believe it was November of 2021. And during that time frame, I had some particular opinions about the governor that, there were parts of me that said he was more electable than Donald Trump on one hand and less electable on the other. And I think that a lot of my opinions about him really have changed, seeing how popular he remains in the state of Florida and how truly electable I think he actually is. If there's one person in particular I think the Democratic Party should be exceptionally afraid of, it is Governor Ron DeSantis. While he might have barely won his governor election back in 2018, I can guarantee you he is going to blow out the margins in the state of Florida this November. In addition to that, Ron DeSantis has just maintained a level of popularity that we've never seen for a governor for quite some time now in the state of Florida. It's very competitive in many of these gubernatorial races, and this time around, I think Ron DeSantis is really set to win by an exceptionally large amount, and that doesn't come easy. So taking a look at this matchup, we are doing it from the perspective of today, where we are right now, and we're going to go ahead and get started. Before we do, though, I do want to do a little bit of background information. Ron DeSantis also serves as, potentially speaking, the second place candidate in the Republican presidential nomination. Polling data across the nation shows that in a matchup between Donald Trump and without Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis is either in second place when Donald Trump is thrown into the mix or in first place when Donald Trump is taken out of the mix. The point being, Ron DeSantis is the go-to nominee. Sometimes, even when Donald Trump is on the ballot, he does pose a significant threat in some of these key swing states, especially for the Republican primary. In addition to that, Joe Biden is exceptionally unpopular nationwide, down 13 points, 13.2% to be exact, according to FiveThirtyEight. Very similar according to Real Clear Politics. Democrats are down in the generic ballot by 2.2%. I get this is for 2022, but these numbers largely reflect what we should expect in the general election in 2024. As for Kamala Harris, she is also disapproved of by about 12 points. The numbers generally do fluctuate. Weeks ago, Kamala Harris was disapproved of by 26 points, and then now it's 12 points. It's interesting to see, but these numbers do tend to be very negative for the Democratic Party and really haven't been positive for Kamala Harris since the beginning of her term as vice president. So now that we have Joe Biden here with these numbers and we have an understanding about the generic ballot, about Kamala Harris, about Joe Biden in general, let's go ahead and move forward to our 2024 presidential map. So we remain with the total number of 538 electoral votes. 270 are needed to win. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. Doing a little bit of background, Donald Trump and Joe Biden actually won their elections by the same exact margin, just obviously with different states. In 2016, it was 306 to 232. In 2020, it was 306 to 232. So I also think that is quite interesting, quite funny if you ask me. You rarely ever see that happening in American history. I'm not even sure if it has happened in American history where you have, the complete flip of the electoral college vote in favor of one party versus the other. But the point being that this margin for Joe Biden and Donald Trump, neither of which were super significant, which means we are now about at a level playing field for both of these candidates. Looking at the states that we can characterize straight off the bat, these are states that we can characterize as safe states. Ron DeSantis will run up the margin in many of these regions across the nation and will do very well in many states that Donald Trump might have even had a position where he was only winning by 14, 15 points. I think Ron DeSantis could expand on many of these states. As we continue to move across the nation, many of the safe red states really don't need further discussion simply because we know how they're going to go. You can expect these to be 15-point plus margins for the GOP. For instance, Oklahoma is a plus 30 state for Republicans in presidential elections. Expect that for Ron DeSantis. California is a plus 25 state for Democrats in presidential elections. Expect that for Joe Biden. Biden also has a safe state in the state of Illinois, Maryland, Delaware, his home state, New Jersey, New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and the District of Columbia, and the state of Hawaii. Beyond that, I would also characterize, potentially speaking, Maine's 1st congressional district, and that leaves us at 232 toss-up electoral votes on our map here, which means more than half of it has already been characterized. And this is typically how it goes in presidential elections. We already know how the majority of these states are going to vote. That's the weird thing about American politics, is that because we don't have a traditional popular vote system or a parliamentarian system, the Electoral College pretty much puts us in a position where we are always focusing on the same states. And this is not at all to criticize or praise the Electoral College, just something to point out. So if you're wondering why in many of my other predictions I've made matchups between Biden and Romney, Trump and Biden, Harris and Trump, Harris and DeSantis, when you look at those, a lot of these states are going to look the same because regardless of who's running, they are largely going to look the same because these states are just so exceptionally partisan that it's very difficult to see how an opposition party could win. And it really would take, something insane happening, and that doesn't just happen with these individual candidates, both of which I would think Joe Biden and Ron DeSantis would be able to hold their own. So 232 toss-up races, electoral votes here doesn't mean that we don't have an idea as to how some of these states are going to vote. For instance, the state of Colorado is a state that voted for Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential election by 13.5%. I would say that Colorado is a likely Democratic state. I think Democrats are going to win it, but I don't think it's going to be by a margin of 15 plus points. I think also we could potentially see Colorado become competitive at some point in the future, whereas a state such as Maryland or Illinois or California wouldn't be in that position. The neighboring state of New Mexico, I would also characterize as a likely blue state. Though some try to argue that Ron DeSantis has an appeal to Hispanic voters, I would say that his appeal is limited to mainly Hispanics in Florida. The general idea and understanding here is that Florida Hispanic voters are not the same as national Hispanic voters. You see very different groups, and Hispanic voters across the nation are not a monolith. What appeals to one group might not appeal to the other. It's sort of the way that we look at American politics altogether. There isn't a simple way to appeal to any minority group, any majority group, or any type of affinity group across the country. So for the state of New Mexico, I would say President Joe Biden wins it by a likely blue margin in this matchup against Ron DeSantis. As we move over towards the East Coast, the Republican Party has some likely states. We actually just covered over one. The state of Texas here is a likely red state. The reason why I think Texas would be likely red is not because I think that Ron DeSantis would return us back to a Romney or McCain era type of victory. McCain won by 12, Romney won by 16, but rather that he would be able to slightly improve off of where President Trump was back in 2020. Donald Trump won the state of Texas by 5.6%. That was a likely characterization. And I think looking at that number, I see it as something that tells me, sure, Texas could become competitive and technically was competitive back in 2020, but also that the right GOP candidate could reverse the trends at least slightly. And I think Ron DeSantis is a candidate that could do that. I think he's very much going to capture the Trump vote while still walking back some of those suburban voters that might have moved away from the GOP because of Donald Trump. I think Ron DeSantis offers that individual appeal that really makes him more electable than Donald Trump, at least for 2024. And I think Texas is an example about where we could see some expanded margins for the governor. As for the next states that are going to be characterized as likely red, I would characterize Iowa and Ohio as likely Republican states. They were both likely Republican in 2016 and 2020. And while I do think that Ron DeSantis will slightly underperform President Trump, I do think that he could win Iowa by a margin of 6 or 7 points. And the same thing in the state of Ohio. Donald Trump's damage to the Democratic Party in these two states was extremely substantial. He made it so they have very slim chances at victory, and in moments that they do have victory, such as 2018, it's by slim margins and by no real large expectation whatsoever. For these two states, I would say that Ron DeSantis maintains the margins that Donald Trump had, just underperforms them slightly. Previously, I thought that it could be lean red states. Ron DeSantis is not Donald Trump. He does not bring out the crowds to the same extent, but he does a very good job at least coming close, whereas many other Republicans simply cannot say the same. I also think Ron DeSantis really captures in the essence of the Make America Great Again voter, the Make America Great Again base. And that's something that will help him in these states that shifted heavily away from President Obama and Democrats beyond the 2016 election. For right now, I'm comfortable characterizing those two states as likely red. The next state that I would characterize, and the final state I would characterize as a likely Republican state, is the state of Florida. Now, some people might be upset to see this characterization in a state that is typically so contested and so heavily watched. But Ron DeSantis, again, is popular for a reason. I think Ron DeSantis' governing style and ability to remain in favor with the media and amongst minority groups in the state is a testament to his electability, and his electability specifically in the state of Florida. There's a reason why he went from winning in the governor election back in 2018 by just 0.4%. I mean, I kid you not, in very, very narrow margin in 2018. Yet goes on to polls now and finds himself in a position where, if we go ahead and take a look at the governor numbers, head over to the state of Florida and look at 2022, he's winning in some of these polls by 24 points, 16 points, 19 points, 21, 16, 23. If you're wondering why I'm jumping over these, I very much think Phillips Academy and the political matrix are outliers, because we never see any numbers of this sort showing anything but Ron DeSantis ahead. I mean, very few times, and the only ones backing it up really are the political matrix group, which seem to be very out of the average here. But the point is that Ron DeSantis, I think, definitely could run up the margin in the state of Florida, waste the Democratic Party's money and time, while also benefiting from keeping that state solidly in the Republican column. It's 30 electoral votes. It will be super impactful, and I think Ron DeSantis absolutely will win it. And I said there were no more likely Republican states, but there actually is a likely Republican district, and that is Maine's 2nd congressional district. And with that characterization, I would also characterize Maine at large as a likely blue state. And that brings us to 198 electoral votes for President Biden and 219 for Governor DeSantis. That leaves 121 toss-up electoral votes, where these states and districts, or singular district for Nebraska's 2nd, could go any direction. But as of right now, I think I have a general idea as to how I can expect many of them to go. I'll start off over here on the West Coast, and I will first characterize the state of Nevada as a lean blue state. Now, I don't know if everyone would agree with me on this point, but I think looking at Nevada's history and its willingness to vote for Democrats, including President Biden, that Biden would be able to win it over DeSantis by a similar margin to how he defeated Trump back in 2020, or the same way Hillary Clinton defeated Trump back in 2016. I think there is a limit for Republicans in the state of Nevada on the presidential level. There is also a reason why the last time they won it was all the way back in 2004. And even looking at that, that was not exactly an impressive margin. It was 2.6%. George W. Bush was winning in Colorado by larger, winning in Virginia by larger, winning in Florida by larger. The point being that Nevada typically was a competitive state, and Democrats did tend to do better. Hillary Clinton and Biden won by the same margin, and I think we could see a similar thing happen in 2024. As for the state of Arizona, I would actually flip this state back into the Republican column. While I don't think this is because of a sudden shift amongst Hispanic voters in the state of Arizona, I do think it is a shift amongst white voters, specifically suburban voters in Maricopa County, that would be more than willing to vote for Ron DeSantis, that might have been apprehensive about voting for Trump in the 2020 election. The Trump effect and negative impact on Texas, Georgia, and Arizona was very, very real. When you take a look at the difference between 2016 and 2012, there are many states that got a lot redder, but some that got bluer. Virginia got about 2 points bluer, Georgia 3 points, Arizona 6 points, Texas 7 points. These states shifted over because Donald Trump was the nominee, not because Hillary Clinton was strong. And that's why by the time you reach 2020, Texas, Georgia, and Arizona all became states that narrowed up, and 2 of them ended up flipping in favor of the Democratic Party. Looking at these states now, I think while Joe Biden will still do better than Obama did in 2008 and 2012 in both of these states, that Ron DeSantis will be able to walk back some of these suburban voters and win them over to shift the margin ever so slightly in favor of the Republicans in this map. That brings Ron DeSantis to 230. The first flip has already been allocated in the state of Arizona, and the Democrats are at 204, President Biden, at that point. And Nebraska's 2nd district also flips. I would characterize that as a lean Republican district. And that leaves us with 103 toss-up electoral votes. The entire major part of the Rust Belt that is typically competitive, 3 states that are below the Mason-Dixon line, and the state of New Hampshire, which also will be quite interesting. To start, we'll move down to the state of Georgia and move our way upwards and continue on as we move through these states. For the first state of Georgia, I would characterize this, for very similar reasons to Arizona, as a lean Republican state. I think there will be a shift amongst suburban voters back in favor of the GOP once the Republicans get a nominee that is level-headed, sensible, and while still might represent the same ideology as Donald Trump, at least puts a different spin on it. Ron DeSantis is a very good speaker. He is able to say everything and do everything that Donald Trump wishes for and has done, and still remain popular in a state that gave Joe Biden a significant portion of the vote back in 2020. There's a reason why Ron DeSantis can do things better than Donald Trump, and I think that would be best employed in Arizona and Georgia, that would be willing to have voters here that would be okay with voting for a Republican like DeSantis, but not a Republican like Trump. And that's where I really think DeSantis shines as an electable candidate for the Republican Party. For the neighboring state of North Carolina, this is another state I would characterize as lean red. The margin of victory for for Donald Trump in 2020 was 1.3%. I think we could see something similar happen in 2024 for Ron DeSantis, but a victory is a victory. It's a margin that is inconsequential when you take a look at the eventual outcome, because it's a winner-take-all system. That brings Ron DeSantis to 263 and Joe Biden to 204. It's not all bad news, though, for Joe Biden. He wins the state of Virginia. I would say it does narrow down. This is another state where I would say that voters are very much against Trump, but sometimes are willing to vote for Republicans. For instance, in 2020, Virginia went to Joe Biden by 10.1%. But guess what happened in the governor election last November? Virginia went to Glenn Youngkin by 2 points. That is a 12-point shift across the state. It's very, very substantial. It's a margin that we really thought the Democratic Party would have been terrified about, and they probably very much are. The state of Virginia could narrow down, especially if Ron DeSantis chooses potentially Youngkin as his VP nominee. I also think there's a very realistic chance that Ron DeSantis just narrows down the race itself, because it was narrow in 2016, it was narrow in 2012, it was narrow in 2008. That's because those Republicans, at least narrower than 2020, and that's because those Republicans made at least some sense to the voters in Northern Virginia. I think Ron DeSantis definitely could do that in 2024. And that leaves us at 58 toss-up electoral votes: Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and the state of New Hampshire. We'll start with the state of New Hampshire, which I would characterize as a lean Democratic state. Well, Ron DeSantis' expansiveness and ability to reach out to voters is very strong. I still think that Biden is able to hold on to the state of New Hampshire. Democrats have room to fall in New Hampshire, in Virginia, in Colorado, in New Mexico, which is why I largely expect them to win it now. Had these been states that were decided as close as Arizona and Georgia in 2020, I would be a lot less willing or confident that Democrats would be able to win there again in 2024. I don't think Ron DeSantis offers too much different from what voters in the state of New Hampshire rejected not only in 2016, but also in 2020. While Donald Trump was certainly not the best candidate that Republicans could have ran for the state of New Hampshire specifically, I do think that there is some blue identity within the state that would keep it blue, even in a circumstance and matchup between these two candidates. We're moving ourselves back into the Rust Belt, where this is now moving ourselves back into the Rust Belt. We have 4 states that are going to determine the margin of victory for either political candidate and who ends up winning the 2024 matchup between these two. So we'll start out with the state of Minnesota. I would characterize Minnesota as a lean blue state. Similar to 2016, I think it could narrow up. I'm thinking maybe a 3 to 4 point margin, not necessarily 1 to 2% for Donald Trump's victory in 2016 and what that narrowed up Minnesota to be. I think Minnesota continues its streak of voting for the Democratic Party, and it will be quite interesting to see how close it actually gets this upcoming presidential election year. As for the state of Wisconsin, I would characterize this as a lean red state. So that already puts Ron DeSantis over 270 electoral votes. So you know that I expect Ron DeSantis to win a matchup between Biden and himself. I think DeSantis is strong enough to win in Wisconsin. I also think he is strong enough to win in Pennsylvania. These are 2 states that were decided by 1 point or less in 2020 and also 2016. But I think, again, DeSantis walks back those suburban voters that definitely moved away from Trump, and also were able to counteract some of the losses amongst minority groups that Joe Biden experienced. For the final state of Michigan, though, I will say the 3-point margin victory for Biden, while not at all substantial, I think could be enough to keep him over the finish line in the state of Michigan. Michigan is an interesting state. I don't know how willing they would be to vote for Ron DeSantis. I think DeSantis is able to exploit the newfound redness of Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, but Michigan is currently controlled by Democrats. At least there are 2 Democrats in the U.S. Senate from Michigan. There is a Democratic governor who is likely going to win re-election this November. And I also think just based off the margins in both 2016, 2020, and also even looking back at 2012 or 2008, Michigan consistently is the bluest state. And while that might be surprising to some, it's not too surprising altogether. It's largely led by suburban voters, rural voters, and urban cities voting for the Democratic Party in ways that are unexpected, and it results in Democratic victories. I think Michigan could remain as a tilt Democratic state in a matchup between Ron DeSantis and Biden. In this final map, though, DeSantis does flip the state of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia from the 2020 presidential election, but maintains them from the 2016 presidential election. Biden flips no states or districts beyond what he carried back in 2020 and ends up at 246 electoral votes. One thing that I think you should take away from this is that the Democratic Party should be afraid of Ron DeSantis. He is a very strong candidate for the GOP. He would lock down the state of Florida. He's popular with unpopular takes. He comes across as more reasonable than Trump and appeals to moderates while also appealing to the Trump base. But I will say there are some shortcomings about Ron DeSantis. Number one, he isn't Donald Trump, which means he's not going to get the enthusiasm and level of support immediately at least, and might not be able to drive out crowds the same way that Trump could. He also might be opposing Trump in the nomination process, which could fracture the GOP ahead of a presidential election, but there, of course, is no guarantee about that. And also, there is some baggage that Ron DeSantis currently carries with him. I think there's a lot of COVID damage, a lot of scandals, and a lot of things that might not matter to Florida voters, but might matter on the national level. Florida does tend to vote to the right of the nation, and I think that while voters there might not necessarily care as much as, national voters do, Ron DeSantis could have things following him through the election season that could make him a little bit more unelectable from what this map might suggest. So 292 for Ron DeSantis, 246 for Joe Biden. It's a victory for the GOP. Joe Biden becomes just a one-term president, and Governor Ron DeSantis from the state of Florida is elected the 47th president of the United States of America. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.